Well, I think we can start as other people are joining. Well, my name is Karina Vianney. I'm a steering group member of the Nutrition Network, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this meeting. We're very excited. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and thank you very much for our speaker, Dr. Michelle Hermiston, that's here with us today. This webinar is a Nutrition Network and Young SIOP Network and SIOP North America Education Committee joint effort. So we're all very excited to have this collaboration today. It's very good to collaborate with everybody. So the title of the lecture today is Sharing Your Amazing Work with the World, Strategies for Scientific Writing and Getting Your Work Published. And our speaker today is Dr. Michelle Hermiston. She is a professor and vice dean of health research at VinUniversity in Hanoi, Vietnam, and professor emeritus of pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco, where she continues to serve as senior advisor for education and professional development for the UCSF HDCCC Global Cancer Program. She also serves as senior advisor to the SIOP North America Education Committee, and she is very passionate about improving equity in research globally. Thank you so much, Dr. Hermiston, to be with us today. I have, just before Michelle starts her lecture, I just have a few announcements from the Nutrition Network that I'd like to talk to you about. So first, we want to ask you to save the date for a nutrition event on Friday, the October 24. It's going to be, we're having a one-day nutrition research forum in pediatric oncology at Princess Maxima in the Netherlands. That's going to be one day after SIOP ends in Amsterdam. It's an in-person event, and we're very excited to have this event we're organizing, and registration is going to open soon. And watch the space and SIOP communication for more information soon. And we'd also like to tell you that SIOP 2025 abstract submission, the deadline is approaching. It's April 1st, 2025. And nutrition has its own category for abstract submission. So if you're sending an abstract, it's going to be under supportive care nutrition. You can choose that option now. Next slide, please. And we have a WhatsApp group for the latest updates. So if you would like to join, this is the link, and you can also use the QR code to join our WhatsApp group. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. So I'm handing it off to you, and everyone, if you have any questions you'd like to post on the chat, just feel free, and we are monitoring. Thank you so much, Michelle. You're on mute.
After all the Zooms today, I think I'd have that. Sorry about that. So we will also have time for discussion at the end, but do feel free to hop on the chat and I can answer questions as we go. So as Karina said, one of my passions is trying to build equity in research and publications at a global level. And so I'm excited to present this tonight on behalf of SIOP North America. I have two questions, and you can raise your hands or say yes or no in the chat. I'm curious how many people in the audience have written a paper before as a first author? And then my second question, so some but not all. And then the second question is, how many of you enjoy writing the writing process? Raise your hand if you enjoy this. Might be a couple of us, yay. Yeah, so it can be very fun. If it is something that brings you more stress than joy, my goal is to help decrease some of that and to give you some strategies that have been shown in the literature to be helpful. So I like to start with a reminder to keep calm. This is not rocket science. It's much more like baking. And my goal is really to provide a recipe for your success. The data needs to be good, just like when we bake, the ingredients have to be high quality. But if you have good quality data, then following a formula or a recipe to write your paper can be very helpful. In terms of writing a compelling research paper, I want to acknowledge it's not easy. I think it's important to know that most papers actually are rejected in the first journal you try, whether you're from a high, middle, or low income country. This isn't an easy process, but persistence does pay off. I also think that the timing is right, particularly for people who are from more resource constrained settings. There is a growing recognition of and commitment to increasing voices in research. My dear colleague and also the director of our global cancer program at UCSF, Catherine Von Loon, just took over as the editor of Journal of Global Oncology, and she is extremely passionate about this. So I think your timing, if you're from a more resource-constrained area of the world, is good. I have a few key take-home points that I'm going to say up front in case you get distracted or day gets busy or the evening gets busy. Present good data. Make sure that you are internally consistent. Do your numbers add up? That's one of my things I often comment on as a reviewer, is that you have these numbers here and these numbers here, and 1 + 1 is not 3. And so make sure that you're internally consistent. Make sure it's interesting and that it adds knowledge or addresses something novel or a gap in the field. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. You want to make it easy and exciting to read. Most people who review for journals do this as a community service, and it's usually late at night or early in the morning when you're reviewing papers and you're tired. And so you don't want to frustrate the reviewer. Make it easy. If English is not your first language or grammar isn't your strong suit, have a colleague help with that. And then I think it's also very helpful to have a strong cover letter, and I'll give you a formula for writing that at the end. What makes a great paper? I think it's helpful to think about what papers have I read recently that really excite me? Why did they excite me? Why did I think they were a good paper? Model that when you write your paper. What makes your work useful and relevant to scientists who work on other topics in your field? Why will they open it, or click on your paper when they're reading the table of contents? What previous work does your objective or hypothesis build from? So from the reviewer perspective, we have that. This is a question most journals will ask you to say, is this in the top quarter, the middle, middle third, or the bottom third? And so thinking about that as you design your projects and as you write your paper is helpful. And what do you need to do to present or explain to the reader that your data compellingly supports your conclusion? So making sure that whole story is coherent with each other. And then how do my findings change current thinking in the field? And so we do science and research because we want to teach others, move the field forward, do better for our patients, and think about how your work does that. And, part of writing the cover letter and your paper is being a salesperson for your work. Publications get you grants, and grants allow you to do more research. And so to put on that hat of how do I sell this to the audience and make them excited and say, yes, I want to accept this paper in my journal. It's helpful to look at similar papers, especially if this is a relatively new activity for you, and to use those as a guide. There are standard ways to present data in a cohort study. The first figure is usually the patients, and the table 1 is the patient details. The results section and how you organize things, that's not a time to practice your creative writing skills. You want to save that for the discussion. And in the results, really to follow the norms in your field and in your area of science, so that it's easy for the reviewer to read and to process. It's helpful to start with a detailed outline and the figures before you start writing the paper. And especially for those of you who may not have done a lot of writing or written a paper before, discussing it with your mentoring team before you start writing is helpful. Even was listening and I'm like, I have senior in my bio too many times now, but even as someone who's been doing this for quite a while, I always start with an outline. This is how I'm thinking of writing this. Do you think so? You know, there's more heads are always better than one, and you get good suggestions. It saves you time and it usually makes for a better paper. And then just a few elements of style to keep in mind as you go along. One idea per sentence, one concept per paragraph. Use an active voice. It saves you word count and it's more engaging for the reader. And simple phrasing is helpful. You want to stay specific and you want to be precise and accurate, but keep it easy for someone to grasp and to process. Try to avoid really long run-on sentences, particularly for people where English may not be their first language. Really long sentences can be harder to comprehend. In terms of a paper, I think we all know this, but it's actually helpful to review that and to really think about writing your paper in kind of chunks. All of us are very busy. Most of us see patients and do other things. And so having a huge block of time to sit down and write a paper is challenging and rare for most of us. And so putting this into chunks and doing a little bit every day can get you to a paper within a week or two. In terms of, this is the order of what's in a paper: title page, abstract, intro, methods, results, table and figures, discussion. I don't generally write this in this manner, and usually I recommend to mentees to try a different order that I think helps to structure the paper. I used to write from start to end, and I always ended up rewriting several sections once I got into the discussion. Then like, oh, that abstract doesn't set me up for well for this, or I didn't have the right thing in the intro. So the order that I recommend, and you may have a process that works differently for you, that's perfectly fine. I like to start with the table and figures because that really lays out the analytic plan. It tells me what I can try to, make exciting for the reader. After I have that done and I've had my team all sign off on that, and everyone is comfortable with how we're going to structure the paper and the message we want to deliver, I then write the introduction, then the methods, then the results, then the discussion, and then I do actually the abstract and the title last. I find writing the title challenging, and it is, for me, easier to do that at the very end. And I usually, when I send it out for my co-authors to review, I usually have a couple of titles. And usually the actual title of the paper is neither of those and one that somebody else suggests. So, I think saving that to the end makes it a lot, prevents me from having writer's block and makes it a little easier. So let's talk about table and figures, which really are the basis for your analytic plan. I use those as my outline. Many readers will scan through the paper and look at your figures and table before they even read the text. And so they should be able to get in and of themselves the message across. The content should be clear, informative, and engaging. Make clear the main message that you want each figure to deliver. We all have probably participated in journal clubs, and it's usually the title of your figure that we use for the title of that figure when we're discussing it in journal clubs. So it's a way to kind of guide you in terms of, what summarizes the key findings from this figure. You want to make clear the main message you want the figure to deliver, and carefully choose the most effective figures for communicating your main points. And this is another place where I think your mentoring team can be very, very helpful. Okay. In terms of how many, generally 3 to 5. It depends on the rules for the journal, your target journal that you're going to submit to. Few journals will allow you 7, and some will allow supplemental fingers, some will not. You want to think carefully about what you put in a supplement and what you have in the body of the paper. I find it very annoying when I really want to see that piece of data, but I'm reading, a paper on a plane or something and I don't have internet access. So think carefully about, what do people need to see to really understand my data? What can be, additional details they can look up, but they don't have to see right in the moment. Provide several layers of detail. And the other advantage of thinking about your figures is it reduces the length of your text, and most journals have pretty strict word counts. Follow the format for similar papers in your target journal, as well as the kind of science you're doing. So if table 1 is patient's characteristics, how do people usually lay that out? Tables, and then figures 2 to 4, one should be for each research objective that you have in your paper. Make sure they are high resolution. Remember that many people who serve as reviewers for journals may be older and not have the best eyesight. So do not make anything too small for them to read or have to get a magnifying glass out for. Letters and numbers and symbols need to be clear and sufficient size to interpret. Include titles and detailed explanations in the legend rather than in the figure itself. And make sure you define your statistics and how many replicates. Is this, if you're doing more bench-based wet lab research, is your data representative of 3 independent experiments? That's helpful information to include in your figure legend. The axes and the labels need to be large enough to read at least 12 points or more. They can get shrunk down later, but it makes it easier for the reviewer. Make sure you include the figure number. I'm surprised at how often people forget to do that. And then when you're reviewing the paper, it can be very frustrating. You should be able to understand the figure by reading the legend. And in general, a descriptive summary sentence of the figure. And then after that, in detail, what you did, how many patients, the key statistic interpretation. So, e.g. the error bars represent the standard error of the mean or the standard deviation. A star means a p of less than 0.05, a data representative of 3 independent experiments, and so on. Okay, any questions? Let me just check. Okay, so going on to the introduction, which is what I write next. Once you have the figures laid out, you know what you can actually accurately, tell as your story to the audience. And so you want to make that message clear and exciting when you write the introduction. The introduction's purpose is really to provide the key background. It's not a review of the entire literature. It's what do you need to know for this paper only. It needs to be concise and focused. It also should convey why the reader should be interested in the manuscript. And importantly, it's conveying to the journal editor and the reviewers why they should, if a journal can only publish 10% of all the papers it get, why you want to tell them why it should be your paper in this section. Very briefly explains what you did and how you did it. And it's usually 3 to 5 paragraphs. Generally, there's a formula for this. It's like baking. Paragraph 1 is what do we know? Introduce the topic generally. Paragraph 2 is usually what we don't know, orient the readers in the field and show the need for further investigation. Tell them why they should be interested. What is the gap that you are addressing? And then paragraph 3 is a very brief summary of what you did and the objectives of your research. And it's sort of, I think of it as a teaser, or at least that's what I was taught, kind of a brief preview of your key results. After you write your 3 to 5 paragraphs, you want to do a checklist to make sure you've kind of hit the key points. So the questions that I asked myself, does it provide a clear, concise, and coherent description of the literature? Does it accurately report the contribution of all reference works to the field? It is important to make sure that you cite potential people who might be reviewing your paper so that you don't offend anyone. Does it show the need for further investigation? Explain what is unknown? Are the scope and objective of your manuscript clearly established? Does your introduction briefly describe what was accomplished in your research? And does it establish the significance of my current question in relation to previous research? So those are really the things you want to get across in that. And it's helpful to ask yourself those questions at the end. After the introduction, we get to the methods. It is generally a traditional order. Look at the paper in your journal. Most often for clinical research, it's usually the study design, patient inclusion, exclusion criteria, informed consent, if that's applicable, how you did the data collection. Was it a chart review, analyzed in REDCap? or placed in REDCap? How did you do your data analysis? And usually statistical methods are your last paragraph. Important to be clear and concise. I think traditionally we always say the method, somebody else should be able to replicate your experiment. That's really hard to do when you have a word limit. And so some guidelines for thinking about how detail, if it's a well-known procedure or someone in your research group or you have done it before, you can reference where it has been cited before. Briefly describe and reference less known procedures, and then anything that is new you should describe in detail. And a lot of times you can put the details in an appendix, just do the highlights in the see appendix or the supplemental information for more detail. If you're doing more qualitative type of research, providing a rationale for your procedure selection can be helpful. And it's generally traditional for wet lab research to have the manufacturer name and city in parentheses. In terms of your statistical and analytic methods, provide enough detail for a knowledgeable reader with access to original data to verify the results. So be clear about specific analytic methods and which software you used. And if you are doing clinical research, observational studies, make sure that you have an approach to bias and confounding included. Okay, so see, 2 days, you're like a third of the way through your paper already. Next section is the results. This is the fun part, and it's actually pretty easy to do if you've already worked on your table and figures. This is where you get to showcase your key hypotheses, experiments, and findings, and organize them to deliver a great story backed up by evidence. You don't want to dump all the data you have. It's okay to say not shown for some things. You want to use your judgment and think of, I try to be agnostic and just passionate about my own work and what I want to see, ask myself, would I want to see this if somebody else did it? I'd use that as a guide. You want to point out key features in connection to your study aim and try to present data in a logical order. Particularly if you're doing wet lab work, you do not need to present it in the order you did it. Sometimes the last experiment is the one that you'll want to present first. You're really telling a story that comes across and proves your point when doing that. If it's a clinical trial, then doing the usual order for a clinical trial makes more sense. Remember, one concept per paragraph. If it's multiple experiments all trying to prove a single point, you can split those into paragraphs or into subsections. And I generally like subsections that all relate to one figure. Traditional order for clinical studies, make sure that you look at that. And then for basic science studies, you do have more flexibility. And in the results, it's not where you interpret your results, it's where you report the results. So you want to give just the facts and you save the interpretation and what you think you've proven for the discussion part. Helpful is to think of big picture and then get down into the details. And each, paragraph after the big picture is kind of the next detailed ones. They should flow directly and mirror what you write in the you will write in the abstract, what's in your introduction, and what is in the methods. Once in a while, you'll be writing and you're like, oh, this doesn't make any sense, how the order of this. If it doesn't flow appropriately, you need to make sure that the title and the data and the abstract all are coherent with each other. And so just keep that in mind. And after you write those other sections, go back and make sure that your results section actually makes sense. Okay, so you're now 3/4 of the way done. Discussion. The recipe for the discussion, usually the first paragraph and the discussion is usually somewhere between 5 and 7 paragraphs, can vary depending on the journal. First paragraph is summary of the key findings. You don't need to repeat all the results. I just read them 2 minutes earlier, but really the key things and how that relates to the central question that you are addressing in this paper. Paragraphs 2 to 5 are usually interpretation of your key findings. Again, one topic per paragraph. Cite the supporting literature. Are your results the same or different from the literature? Possible explanations. Why are your results important and exciting? The paragraph second to last is usually the discussion of limitations. There are several limitations to our work. Things might be like a single center, maybe we don't have an electronic record, and so we have some incomplete data. You don't want the limitations to make it easy for the reviewers to reject you. So always have a nice sentence at the end. Despite these limitations, our work is of value because is really helpful to have in there. So you want to let them know that you thought of what are the problems, but it still is important, and make that easy for them to understand. And then the last paragraph is the conclusion or future directions. And just a few more details, because I think this is the fun part, to me at least, of writing a paper. It's really where you get to interpret your results in context of the field. And for people who are from more resource varied settings, leverage your strengths. Don't focus too much on aspects that are well established in the literature, but highlight that you are doing this in a resource limited setting and why this is important in your context. For an example for this, because I think I was on a panel with Carlos Rodriguez Galindo and Amos Lowe at a conference, and we were discussing this and common pitfalls that we saw, especially from people from resourced varied setting, is spending lots of time citing the literature more as a review instead of what is really cool and exciting about your work. Showing asparaginase improves ALL outcomes. I'm a leukemia doctor. Even if it's new in your setting, is a known thing. We know that that's an important drug, and that doesn't move the field forward. So it's hard to get that kind of data published. However, showing that you can safely give it in your setting, despite some of the challenges that are there, and that it improves outcomes, that's actually really cool. It's valuable. 80% of children live in resource constrained settings. And so selling things that way of why it's important and novel, and focusing more on the how sometimes than what has already been established in the field can be a useful strategy. Limitations, keep them brief, and highlight how they can lead to next steps. And then the last paragraph is your conclusions. And this is kind of where you get to, the final chance you have to sell it to the reviewers and to the audience. Why should we care about your results? What does this add to the literature? How does your work move the field forward? And I think if you're in a resource varied setting, showing feasibility, highlighting challenges in your setting is actually a fantastic conclusion. And so I can be comfortable with that. After you get all of that done, essentially the abstract is taking the key points from all the other sections. So it's easiest to actually write that last. Sometimes we'll have written this up for a meeting, and then it becomes the outline for your paper. Often as you talk to people at a meeting, at your poster or after your platform presentation, you get lots of ideas. So most of the time the abstract will change a little bit based on those inputs. And so I like to either write it or revise it at the end. In terms of an abstract, remember that it is a summary. We use these in lots of different settings as clinician scientists, presentations, posters, publications, or research studies. Your overall goal is to simply summarize the highlights, and I'll emphasize highlights of the work. You want to make the audience excited to hear your talk, to visit your poster, or read your paper. Most abstracts have a very similar format, and I'm going to give you that recipe. You need to follow the instructions and look and see how was it done by other people for whatever you are submitting for. So tips for success, follow the instructions, can't be emphasized enough. It shows that you are actually a careful clinician scientist. Do they want one paragraph? Is it subheadings? Are there specific fonts or margins? Follow those rules, because it actually reflects on how you approach your science. And if you follow those rules, then they're like, oh, this is a really thoughtful, careful, good scientist. And so sell that right away. Aim for a clear and concise summary of your work. Be internally consistent. Do the numbers add up? Do you address the question or hypothesis that you state in your introduction. Ask for proofreading for grammar and English. And reading it out loud is very helpful. Many times my thesis advisor taught me the ruler technique, where when we write papers, we tend to read it so many times, we miss little small errors. So taking a piece of paper or a ruler and going line by line by line by line, and even saying it out loud to make sure you haven't made any silly mistakes is helpful. This is where Grammarly or one of the AI based kind of proofreaders can be very helpful in terms of making sure that you're checking for grammar in English. Okay. And then what are the components of the abstract? Generally, it's the title, the introduction, which has your purpose or hypothesis. Sometimes they'll make those some specific sections, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. And sometimes this will be all in one paragraph, and sometimes there's specific things, so double check what they want. In terms of the introduction, the first part is usually 3 to 5 sentences. Those become your 3 to 5 paragraphs. So you can look at what you wrote there and bring it back. Generally, it's one sentence that's a summary of the background. The second sentence is usually the gap in the field. And then the third sentence is usually the question, hypothesis, purpose, or goal of your work. And just as an example, and we'll share these, you're free to share these slides afterwards. The purpose of the study is to, or the guiding question guiding this study is, or the aim of this study is, or here we test the hypothesis. This is an example from Dr. Cook, who was one of our pediatric hematology oncology fellows in Vietnam. She's interested in HLH, and so, oops. I go backwards or forwards? Okay. HLH is a rare hyperinflammatory disorder characterized by a cytokine release syndrome that we see frequently at Children's Hospital No. 1 in Ho Chi Minh. So that's the summary of her background. Outcomes for HLH in a resource-limited setting are unclear. That's the gap in the field. And then her goal, the goal of this research is to evaluate the association between clinical manifestations, laboratory features at diagnosis, and treatment with risk of recurrence and 3-year overall survival. That's told me exactly what I'm going to expect. And then I expect the rest of her abstract, as well as the paper, to really tell me exactly those things. So that's where what I mean by internal consistency. When you get to the methods, which is usually, or the approach, which is usually the second part of the abstract, if it's a research study, generally include the design, is it a cohort study, observational, retrospective, prospective, randomized controlled trial, the setting, the sample, the measurement tools, and the approach. The hard part is that you need to do that because there's such a strict word count in 2 to 3 sentences, but it can be done. If the abstract is for a quality improvement project, you want to include the setting, the composition of your team, the participants you worked with, your project intervention. Key point, look at published examples and mirror yours after what you see in the literature. A good general formula can be the research design, followed by the patient population or study, and then research methods, and then the data analysis is usually the last part. And that's actually the same thing we talked about from, how do you write the methods? And so this was Dr. Cook's, a retrospective cohort study, research design, children aged less than 16, that's her patient population, at her hospital in Ho Chi Minh from this time period that met these HLH 2004 diagnostic criteria. This is the data she collected into REDCap, analyzed it with Stata version 14. Descriptive data, so data analysis is the last part, was mean plus minus standard deviation unless noted. So she was able to get that all into 3 sentences, kind of following that algorithm. In terms of the results, just like we've talked about, this is a nice review. They should be the results pertinent to the question. And so she wanted to understand risk factors for recurrence. So results should relate to that. Include results whether or not they support your hypothesis. I think it's really important to remember that we have a hypothesis because we don't know the answer. If we knew the answer, it would be unethical to do the study. So it's okay if you have negative results. It can actually, sometimes those are the most interesting things because they're a surprise. But you want to show the results no matter what, whether or not they're accurate to what your hypothesis was. You want to include control results or data if it's relevant. Present most data, in particular important data, in figures and tables if they're allowed, if you're submitting an abstract for a meeting, and then emphasize the results your data support. So we found is a nice way to do that, and they need to be internally consistent. And then the discussion or conclusions is where you interpret your data, just like before. You need to keep it concise, usually 2 to 3 sentences max. In the abstract, use the same words as found in the statement or purpose. Are the results what you expected? Did you achieve your purpose? If not, that's okay. But then address why not. And a way that you can do that if your hypothesis is wrong is, surprisingly, we found that, and that's actually kind of exciting when it isn't what you expect, and especially if it isn't what the field expected. That's cool. So it can be okay if you don't get the results that you want. I know, I think particularly if you're a fellow or early in your career, that feels disappointing. But I think it's still important information for the field, and so don't get too bummed. You do want to make sure that your conclusions are consistent with the title and the purpose of your paper. So this was Dr. Cook's. So she found HLH is a rare disease with high mortality. EBV infection is the most common trigger in Vietnamese children. HLH should be treated early in infants and children with neurologic symptoms. While limited by being a single institution study, our results suggest that serial analysis of the ferritin concentration is a useful marker to follow treatment response and to guide taper of therapy in children with HLH. And then she actually uses the fact that she's in a resource varied setting to her strength. In low income countries, where secondary infection risk in immunocompromised patients is high, is how she ends that. And what's interesting is that this, when she presented this, has actually led to some practice change in many people in terms of not following the protocol all the way to the end and trying to reduce immunosuppression. And so I think the real value to what she did with her study. So highlight things. I think we're going to learn a tremendous amount from our colleagues in more resource restricted settings in terms of, we're over-treating a lot of kids. Maybe we don't need that. We're also going to learn a lot of important things about supportive care, I think, from other settings. So highlight and emphasize those things that maybe aren't being done or haven't been done well previously in the literature. Last part's the title page. Should be concise. There's usually a word or a character count. Summarizes the key findings of the abstract. Should be supported by and reflect your data. This was the one for the abstract I'm using as an example. The first thing seen by readers, so it will usually determine their first impression. So you do want to give some time to this. When searching PubMed, the results show only the title. So therefore, your title actually really matters if you want to get people to read your work and to cite your work long after you publish it. It needs to be self-contained, 8 to 12 words describing a topic and its aspect. If you call something acute lymphoblastic leukemia, if you're writing a review, that's too generic. Instead, challenges in managing acute lymphoblastic leukemia in the LMIC setting will describe the concise nature and aspect of the research and help people know what to expect. And then I just think this is a useful reminder from one of my colleagues. So, lots of people will read the title, a few people read the abstract, only a very small number will actually read the whole paper, despite the fact that you've labored over it. And so, better you can make the title, the more people you're going to draw into actually reading your paper. Okay. And then I was just checking the chat. How to write effective typos, be declarative. engaging, and focused. And in terms of focus, thinking about the novel findings and how it will move our understanding forward is a good thing to try to summarize in the title. Things to avoid are complex compound nouns, acronyms, and question marks. Though I have to say, I avoid question marks for scientific reports. I think they can sometimes be useful for review. So, look and see what other things are in the your target journal. And then questions, this is another checklist. When reviewing the title, is it accessible and understandable both to the target audience and also to people slightly outside of that? Does it capture the main elements of the work? Does it convey the message that the paper is trying to get across? Does it attract the reader, and is it concise? That's a tall order in 8 to 12 words, which is why I always do it last, because it prevents writer's block that way. It's also, when you're writing the title and the title page, it's helpful to think about authorship criteria. Ideally, it would be useful to do this before you start writing the paper and even before you start the project. The list of authors in general, the first author does most of the work. Middle authors contribute in some way, writing a section, editing, planning, some data collection, and the senior author is the person who coordinated or got the money for the project, and it's usually a senior mentor. Authors do need to have substantial contribution to concept or design or acquisition of data or analysis and interpretation, drafting and critical revision for the manuscript for intellectual content, and final approval of submitted version needs to be done by all authors. This is the order. So first author design may conceive the study. Sometimes that's in partnership or mentorship with the last author, writes the first draft, partners with the last author for subsequent draft. The last author is usually the experienced investigator who partners with the first author in writing the paper. And then second author has a major contribution. The third author, important contributions, and then everyone else who qualifies for authorship is in the middle. Depending on the paper, how many people on the team, sometimes those are done in alphabetical order. The corresponding author's responsibilities, it's usually the first or the senior author. They submit the manuscript, they correspond with the publisher or editor for the revisions, the galleys, proofreading those, and then they receive subsequent correspondence from outside investigators. In terms of the cover letter, brief summary of the findings, statement of non-redundancy of submission or publication, conflict of interest, read and approved by all authors, and contact information for the corresponding author. And most journals will give you a guideline of what they want to see in that. It should be 1 to 2 pages. Shorter is better. Editors are busy. Summarize the gap in the field, the work that addresses, summarize the key findings, and highlight why the audience for the specific journal will be interested in this, and then thank them for their consideration. Here's a more detailed guide of that. We present our article, the title, for consideration for publication in whatever journal you're applying to. As you know, 80% of childhood cancer burden globally is in low and middle income countries, where outcomes are poor relative to high income countries. The World Health Organization has made improving outcomes for children with cancer a priority area. Then you list kind of the key findings. As a first step to improve outcomes in Vietnam, we have performed a retrospective analysis of our experience in osteosarcoma in order to generate baseline data to identify key issues that we addressed in future studies. Our key findings are blank, blank, blank. Why is this interesting? We believe our work will be of great interest to colleagues in similar settings, as well as those in high-income countries who are interested in partnership efforts to decrease disparities between children with cancer in high and low resource settings. Thank you, as always, last part, thank you for your time and consideration. And then the submission progress, you need to select the journal, and then the peer review and journal discussions. So when selecting a journal, think about scope and breadth of the journal, how relevant is it to your research topic, readership of the journal, who's the target audience, reputation and quality of the journal, editorial standards and quality of the peer review, and level of selectivity and likelihood of its acceptance. Don't aim too low, but also be realistic. If your work is not sufficiently significant or novel, you probably don't want to send it to New England Journal of Medicine. Beware of predatory journals. These are publishers that exploit authors by charging them lots of money for a compromised editorial service. They claim to carry out peer review, but may not do so. And that can hurt reputation. So be careful about that. And some fake journals can charge authors fees up front and then disappear, and that's awful. How to distinguish between questionable versus legitimate. Look at the quality of the papers, speak to colleagues in the same field. If open access journal, check, are they a member of direct open access journals, open access scholarly publishers association? Are they listed in PubMed or Scopus? Make yourself familiar with reliable journals in your field and take precautions when considering submitting to a journal you've never heard of. And then just what the process is, this is for the young investigators. It's long, it can be kind of depressing sometimes. You need to have approval of co-authors of the final manuscript after you submit it, and usually everybody will get an email and they need to respond to that. Submission of the manuscript and cover letter. The editorial review is usually 2 to 3 weeks. They may reject or send out for review. The first review is usually 1 to 2 months, and they have choices of reject and revise, conditionally accept, or accept. The second review is usually 2 to 8 weeks, and you have to, depends how good you write your response letter and address the reviewers. It's important to do that respectfully, even if you think they just completely missed the point. The proofs usually are about a month, and then the publication is 1 to 2 months later. So in general, this is not the fastest process in the world. And so just to keep that in mind, if you have deadlines in terms of getting a paper out for funding reasons or those kinds of things. And then a final checklist before you hit submit. Did you follow the instructions? Do everything exactly as they say? Limit your manuscript to the word count, character count requirements. Ask someone to edit for English, or in my case, grammar. Technically edit your work. Do the numbers add up? Does everything make sense? Are all the labels correct? It's amazing how many times I review papers and the labels are switched. So make sure your label, check that, that should be on your checklist of something to pay attention to. Sometimes our thinking evolves as you write the paper. That's part of the fun of doing this, I think. Does your work and what you state actually reflect the stated purpose, aim, or question? If it does not, you should rewrite that because it won't get accepted. Otherwise, does it flow logically? Do the sections in the abstract and in the results, how you summarize them at the beginning of the discussion, is it all the same order? Remember, people do this as a volunteer activity, and you want to decrease cognitive overload by making it easy for the reviewer. And then, did you tell a story? Why should the reader care? Why does your data matter? Because that's really what gets a paper accepted or rejected is this something that a journal wants to invest in and report? So I will stop there. It gives us a little bit of time for questions or comments. Let's see. Any questions from anyone?
Yeah, please. If anyone has a question, you can open your mic or type in the chat. While you're thinking, I'd like to just a comment. I think it's really great to think of this as a recipe. Like there's a process and a procedure, because sometimes when you're starting and you're writing your first papers, it seems like a huge monster. You don't know where to start, and you read these great articles and you're thinking, oh, I'm here, how do I get there? And it's very, very nice to see that there is a process, there is some standards and things you have to follow, and I think it's very helpful. And also, I like the point of view of seeing yourself as the salesperson for your work when you're writing your paper. That is very helpful. I had never thought of it like that. So I thought it was a very, very interesting point.
The other one that I didn't say that I have in a grant writing workshop that I also, similar to this, is to think like a newspaper writer, in terms of how they structure paragraphs. Like, that's what we mostly read. And so making things very clear from that perspective, I think can be helpful. Like, it's not a lot of fancy language or things, it's nice and clear. So, I think that can be helpful.
Yeah.
I
I
will,
I I
oh,
was
go ahead.
wondering if what do you suggest when you're mentoring somebody who English is not their first language? Do you tell them to write in their own language and then translate, or to try and write directly in English? I'm curious to know your opinion on
Um,
that.
I asked them what is easier. I
Okay.
now I've lived in Vietnam for 3 months, so I get a lot of email that's not in English, and Google Translate is my friend. I think I'm starting to try to learn Vietnamese, which is not an easy language. You start to understand like where some of the errors are because of sentence structure and those things. So I think if somebody is having, if they can learn to write in English, it's going to be helpful because we do so much writing. That's the currency of academic careers. So I think that can be helpful to do. If you have writer's block and you can't get going, doing it in your comfortable language first and then translating it is also perfectly fine. So I generally say, do what will help you get this done. And so and over time, I think what I've seen in a lot of people that I've worked with is as they get going and become, practice makes perfect. And, the first one's really rough, and then the next one is easier. I would say that some of the people I work with where English is definitely not their first language actually write much, much better than people who have been only speaking English their entire lives. So but I think it's just give people enough time, especially if it's an abstract for a meeting, to proofread and to correct, because those can take a little bit longer. But I'm just always so impressed at how quickly people learn in terms of getting up to speed with English and things. And sometimes I've found that non-native English writers actually do better because you pay more attention to the sentence structure. And so it can really work nicely. But I think
Yeah.
making sure you have a good outline and kind of what are the purpose of this paragraph, I think can help you write it. And if it's easier to do it in your native language, fine. And then you can always translate it afterwards. And Google,
Right. Yeah, that's
ChatGPT really helps with the translation part. And then you just
it
have to,
does. Translation is really good these days.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
nice.
when I started writing my first papers, I'm from Brazil. I wrote it in Portuguese and then translated each section to send to my mentors, and it takes a little bit more time, but I think it's for me it gave me confidence to see how is this written in English, and then as you go along you learn, and now I've been writing directly in English, and I think it's easier and saves some time, but yeah, it's a process too.
I
I
appreciate you
totally
sharing that. I
agree.
think that it's helpful. That's a good question.
Yeah, but I'm always curious because now I'm mentoring some other Brazilian colleagues, and they are doing this and going through that process and asking me, should I try writing in English or in Portuguese and translate? And I'm always thinking about this and what would be a good answer.
Yeah, I
But
I
that was
think the answer is fine, whatever helps you get it done. And,
right.
especially it has to be in English because that's the language of most journals. And I think for, getting your work on an international stage should be all of our goals. But
Yeah.
whichever is easier, I think is fine, personally.
Yeah, the outline definitely helps. I think that really saves a lot of time to just have an outline for each section, and helps you organize the idea and the order of things that you want to say, and then you just start to write. I think that's a great tip.
I found his help. And I think You know, when I was a graduate student, you had all time of the day to write. And when you get farther into your career, you don't have that luxury. And so having, you know, doing it piecemeal is helpful. I know you guys had one more slide. People are more than welcome to use this. I just give credit to the different sources is requested. And then this is your last.
Oh yeah, this is our last slide. Well, does anyone have any questions or comments you'd like to ask? I'd just like to make one final comment. As the more you publish your paper, you then start to get invited to be a peer reviewer, which I think is really good if you're starting and in mid-career. I think it helps develop a lot of your writing if you are reviewing other people's manuscripts as well, right? I think that's very enriching experience.
Yeah, and I would encourage junior people to ask their mentors if they have any papers to review, can you review with them? You know, so I usually will review a paper in partnership with I try to have I used to be the fellowship director at UCSF, and I would have all of my fellows do like 2 papers with me, because it does, when you have to critique, and junior people are so much more critical than senior people in general. But it is really helpful because once you've done that process a couple of times, it will change how you write yourself.
That's a great idea to do it in partnership. Great idea. Very nice. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Hermiston. This was fantastic. This was very, very helpful.
I'll send you the slides so that you can feel free to distribute them into your network if that's helpful.
Thank you, of course. Yeah, it will be very, very helpful. And thanks everybody for attending. And we'd just like to let you know that we have these educational webinars in the Nutrition Network monthly, usually the last Wednesday of every month. And the next one will be on March 26th. So everybody's welcome, and you will get more information in the next few weeks. Thank you, thank you everybody so much.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.